order that he got it, Surah Al-Baqarah, said that God's guidance was available to anyone. That God's guidance was available to people who established regular prayers, who believed in things they could not see, which we'll come back to in a moment, who spent out of what was provided to them, and in whose hearts was the assurance of the hereafter. And we're told that this man was primitive and people draw cartoons about him and all this other sort of stuff. But the central lesson of capitalism over communism is that central authorities have a hard time solving individual problems as efficiently as people do on their own. If a man makes refrigerators, capitalism has successfully taught us that he will figure out a way, because that's all he thinks about, to get that refrigerator to someone who doesn't have it, better than a government that has to make 7 million decisions about the same thing. Zakat means spending out of what is provided to you. It's not about 2.5%. It's not about some comparison to what Revenue Canada does. It's not about 7,000 lines in a code that says, you know, if you have this kind of cattle or that kind of sheep or this kind of colored horse, you know, Abdul in the corner over there should basically get an extra ride on Sunday. Zakat is about a way of seeing the world that makes you responsible for the betterment of your fellow man. Zakat in education says that if you know something, you have to share it with those people who don't. If you're a doctor, your neighbors had better be healthy, whether they're paying you or not. If you're a strong person, then you should lift things for those people who are moving or weak. Zakat between husband and wife means that when the wife cooks for the husband, that's an act of charity. She's not required to do it. Yes, brother, she's not required to do it. It is her act of mercy to you. Zakat from a poor person might be a smile to somebody else who's having a bad day. Zakat from a leader is that he spends his entire time thinking about the betterment of his so-called followers, not the betterment of himself. Zakat is a way of looking at the entire world around you with a fresh set of eyes to answer the question that God whispers in your ear every day. What have you done to make life better for those people around you? Zakat in athletics is to train other people to be healthy. Zakat in deen is to educate other people in the deen. Zakat in justice is to be merciful to people when they have injured you in some way. Zakat is a way of looking at life that says that one day all of us will be before Almighty God for judgment. And on that day, every one of us will wish that Almighty God saw what was best in us and forgave what was worst in us. For if we were judged by the worst of our deeds, I myself and everybody in this masjid would not make paradise. This is the teaching of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if we wish for God to be merciful to us, to exercise a form of charity to us in our deeds, how can we then not exercise the same charity to those people who are around us? Now let me return to my point about Clinton and all these other guys that are venerated. The mark of a great man and a great leader is not his ability to work within the system that he's already been handed. It's his ability to see that system for what it actually already was, and to challenge it and change it. Prophet Ibrahim looked at a system of idolatry where people were worshipping stones and proposed to the people that instead they worship one God. This is someone who took the world as it was handed to him, and said, no, something here is wrong. Something needs to be changed. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was confronted in a world that was the opposite of zakat. Slavery existed, riba existed, force, blood feuds, complete lack of regard for anyone who was weaker, be it woman, child, orphan, you name it, in the society. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came to a society that had a system that was handed to him, a system that he personally would have benefited from, a system his family had benefited from. And like Prophet Ibrahim before him, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, no, this is wrong. This needs to change. The difference between Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Bill Clintons and the Winston Churchills and Franklin Roosevelts of this world, where all of these other people bought into the assumption that the deck of cards they were handed by their society were the only cards that they could play. That what society was given to them must be, in some way, 99.9% right. And their job was to use the tools and institutions handed to them to try to make it 1 or 2% better, as opposed to 1,000% better. So Clinton would tell you, for example, that it's important to have a free press. Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would tell you that the object of life is for man to run towards God. That zakat is one example of how man runs towards God. That a mosque is where a free and unfettered and righteous imam would tell you whether or not society has actually achieved that objective. You don't need to read about it in a newspaper that's owned by people who already have a lot of money and is therefore much more sensitive to their interests than anybody else. You don't need an elected official to tell you that either. If we are all in this gigantic race towards God, because of the 10 years that Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam devoted to explaining who God is and why we are in fact all dependent on Him, if that is indeed our journey, far before the government finds out who is poor, a man's neighbor will find out who is poor. Far before the government needs to do something about a community in distress, their mosque will do something about a community in distress. Far before the government builds a school to educate people, someone who has education will determine in 5 seconds that the brother he's talking to doesn't speak English or understand him well enough and start to train him. Someone who's a welder looks at someone who's unemployed and says, would you like to work where I work? Yes, eventually you'll get a course, but here, let me tell you what that course is going to teach you. Someone who knows how to drive teaches someone who doesn't know how to drive, because he has zakat in his head for that one skill that he has. We are under the dominion of a beneficent, all-loving, and all-powerful God. Our efforts in this world matter nothing to that God. They matter for ourselves. They matter for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's judgment of whether we were right or whether we were wrong, whether we heard and listened or whether we didn't listen. And that is why the economic result achieved by Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's way of life was that by the time Umar bin Khattab was Khalifa, there was nobody to give the zakat to in economic terms. Because the world at that time was populated by people like Zain al-Abidin, who used to pray from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning in the mosque and cry so much people thought he would almost go blind. And when Zain al-Abidin finally died and they came to wash him for burial, they saw that there were marks like rope all across his shoulders, like somebody was beating him every day. And nobody could understand why he would have these marks on his body and his shoulder. As they saw him in the masjid literally all hours of the night. They said, who is beating Zain al-Abidin? Until at his janazah it came out that every night before he went to the mosque, he used to buy so much bread, or bake bread, or otherwise obtain it, and carry it to the poorest people, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and spend so much time carrying the sack that the fabric of the sack ripped into his shoulders as though a man was beating him and he was scarred for life. This is the awareness of taqwa. This is what our brother Nidal talked about last week when he said that you have to act as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching you. It's ihsan. He's watching you and is speaking to you in every moment of your life. Even though you don't see him, he is like he is there. If you have a group of people who is educated in their understanding, their obligation, their duty, not only to themselves, but to the people around them, no government on earth will exist that stands between man and his duty. No leader on earth will be able to steal the resources of the people. Not because the people want them for themselves, but because they want them to be applied to those who actually need them. No government will build an army full of people that never fight on behalf of the people that are in the society, but actually shoot instead on them. We have made cartoons of our deen because we have not used our deen to challenge the oppression in our own society and the mockery of a justice system and economic system in this society. We don't need guns to shoot people. We need to open their minds to blow up the demons in their head that tell them that this is all we got and this is the best we can do and that ours is the most successful society in human history. By what measure? As Muslims, we are taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who establishes the scorecard in the game of life. And that scorecard has certain measurements on it. We're measured on our personal faith. We're measured on our honesty, on our character, on our integrity, on our compassion, on our mercy. We're measured on our sense of justice, on the love that we have for what God has given us, and on the love that we have for those people around us, whether they share our faith or they don't. These are the measures by which God, who made us, decides whether or not we lived a righteous life. And we live in fear of the day when that judgment will be brought to our account. But instead of saying to the world that all the welfare systems, all the property rights enforcements, all the banking reforms will never replace the free, spontaneous, and relentless action of people to improve the lives of their neighbors, of people to remind themselves of their duty to God, instead of challenging the failure for the last 300 years of an economic system that has never come close